Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. As Susan mentioned, the next item, 6C, is the work plan and budget for the Songs Mitigation Monitoring Program for 2016 and 2017. Before I get to the work plan and budget, I, along with my colleague, Dr. Steve Schroeder from the University of Santa Barbara, would like to take a few minutes to give you some background on the program, as well as a status update on the mitigation projects. Next slide, please. The Songs Mitigation Program is one of the Commission's, if not the longest running projects. It began in 1974 when the California Coastal Zone Conservation Commission, the predecessor to the Coastal Commission, approved a permit for the construction of the operation of Units 2 and 3, the San Onofre Power Plant. At the time the permit was issued, the magnitude of the impacts to the marine environment from operation of these nuclear power generators, and specifically the cooling water system, was not well understood. And so, the permit included a condition that required a comprehensive impact study, and it created a dedicated independent scientific body called the Marine Review Committee to conduct that study. The Marine Review Committee collected data on kelp, invertebrates, fish, water quality, and physical ocean parameters before and then after Units 2 and 3 came online in 1983. The before and after data were compared to determine the actual marine impacts associated with the operation of songs. Next slide, please. Based on these studies conducted by the Marine Review Committee, the Commission concluded that the Songs cooling water system, which pumped approximately 2.4 billion gallons of ocean water per day, had two principal types of adverse impacts to the marine environment. First, the two intake pipes, which you can see here on the upper left corner of the slide, entrained and killed all immature stages of fish, resulting in substantial losses of nearshore fish in Southern California. Second, the discharges from Units 2 and 3 created warm and turbid plumes that had substantial adverse impacts on giant kelp and associated fish and invertebrates, especially at the San Onofre kelp forest, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. Next slide, please. The Commission determined that the adverse marine impacts caused by Songs operations could be adequately compensated for by a mitigation package that included 4 conditions. The first condition required Southern California Edison to create a tidal wetland to provide out-of-kind mitigation for losses of immature fish entrained in the intakes. The second condition required Edison to maintain and install devices called behavioral barriers that encourage fish to swim away from the intake openings, thus reducing fish losses due to impingement. The third condition required Edison to construct a kelp reef to mitigate for losses of kelp, fish, and invertebrates at the San Onofre kelp forest. And finally, the fourth condition set up the administrative structure of a monitoring program independent of Edison to evaluate the success of these mitigation projects. These conditions were incorporated into the Songs permit through an amendment in 1991, which officially kicked off the beginning of the Songs Mitigation Monitoring Program. These conditions were then modified in 1997, partway through the mitigation.
The San Mateo kelp just south of the reef and the barn kelp about 12.5 kilometers to the south. As Kate pointed out, the kelp reef mitigation was done in 2 phases. The first phase was an experimental reef. It was short-term and lasted for 5 years, small scale. Actually, it's a fairly large reef, but it's 24 acres, about 24 acres. And the purpose of the experimental phase was to test a range of different reef designs. The second phase, called the mitigation phase, and so I don't know if you can see it, but the experimental phase are these pink squares that are kind of scattered north to south. The second phase is the mitigation phase. It's long-term for the operating life of the power plant. It's large-scale. There were an additional 152 acres added in 2008, and the aim of this is to compensate for the resources lost due to Songs. And so the added 152 acres are shown in green hat, and food for the biota in the kelp forest. One of the standards that has not been met to date is the fish standing stock. And the permit requires that the standing stock of fish at the mitigation reef shall be at least 28 U.S. tons. This slide shows a time series from the beginning of the monitoring. The green triangles are actually data that we have collected through 2014. The open triangle is preliminary data. We're not through the monitoring yet. And so fish standing stock went from a low of about 6 tons, and in 2014 to a high of about 25.5 tons. And given this big increase, the thought was, well, maybe it's, going toward the standard. However, and this was during last year when there was anomalously warm water, the blob, and we have speculated as to why, we got a big influx or increase in fish standing stock, but then it's gone down. And so overall, it looks like over the 7 years of monitoring, the fish standing stock has not been met, and it doesn't look like it's going to be met in the future. So this is an issue that we are dealing with. And 3 feet off of the bottom, with an average coverage of 48%. Question we have asked using data that we've gathered since 2000 from the experimental through the performance monitoring stage is 48% coverage of low relief rock sufficient to sustain 28 fish over the long term? And over the last couple of years, we have done extensive analyses in conjunction with our science advisory panel, and the conclusion that we have come to is that no, it's not. It's simply not big enough to sustain 28 tons over the long term, and so this brings up the issue of remediation to address this problem. This is a summary of the mitigation credit for the Wheeler North Reef from 2009 through 2014. So in the early first 3 years, it did not meet the fish standing stock. Actually, it hasn't met them in any of the years so far. And for the first 3 years, it didn't meet the relative standards, but since 2012, it has met all of the standards except for the fish standing stock standard. And this concludes my remarks. Thank you for your attention.